The culture has been influenced in Canada since cannabis was legalized, but on the business side, it's not necessarily healthy. That's why we're intrigued by this conversation with Matt Lammers.
Overall, the businesses have lost about $25 billion so far, mostly concentrated by the large companies like Canopy Growth, Aurora Cannabis. Canadians consume roughly the same amount of cannabis annually as they do beer. It's about $8 billion a year. The cannabis industry still isn't being taken seriously by serious people. They pretended to take it seriously in 2017 to 2019, but that was only when they thought they could make a lot of money. There's a lot of doom and gloom in the industry, but I have to say, if you were to ask me, is legalization a success or a failure? I would say it's a success. When Canada legalized cannabis, and this happens in any country that legalizes either recreational or medical cannabis, they don't take their hands off the steering wheel. They don't legalize it and forget about it. It's one of the most heavily regulated substances on the planet still, and one of the most heavily regulated substances in Canada. It's heavily overregulated, and that's the whole point. They want it to be overregulated for, I guess, a few different reasons. One of them is that it's more politically palatable if it's overregulated. And the other reason is they want to control, they want to have some control over where the profits go, to them, obviously. And the other reason is for health reasons. There are still a lot of skeptics that think cannabis shouldn't have been legalized, or they think, okay, it's legalized. Now we want to see evidence that it's not doing harm to society, or more harm than prohibition was.
I want to pump your platform, MJBizDaily.com. It's where I get a lot of my news. I keep a keen eye on this industry, and it certainly caught my attention yesterday when you and your team reported that cannabis operator Aleafia had entered creditor protection after a failed merger. This was creditor protection order granted by an Ontario court. Aleafia in particular is an interesting one to watch because of some of the pretty high-profile names that were connected to or affiliated with this startup right out of the gates, including Julian Fantino, former police chief in Toronto, former Conservative cabinet minister. It now looks like, and I'm going off your reporting, I'll ask you to take us into this, they might leave Canadian taxpayers on the hook for close to $10 million.
This is shady, but it's not any shadier than any other cannabis company filing for creditor protection. It's not unusually shady. It's interesting because, you had a former Toronto police chief, you had a former RCMP deputy commissioner leading this cannabis business, people who had, you could say, they profited from criminalization because they were gainfully employed by locking up people who were consuming cannabis for decades. And a lot of people, if you look at the politics for a second, a lot of people say, oh, all these liberal insiders and liberal spouses are on these boards of cannabis companies, but it's conservatives too. It's not a liberal thing. It's a white collar downtown Toronto, downtown Ottawa thing, downtown Montreal thing. Like a lot of these wealthy white guys who have no business in the cannabis industry started cannabis companies and totally embarrassed themselves by losing billions of dollars. So that's the interesting thing about that company. And that's $10 million in unpaid excise tax. And the other $3 million was the Q's free COVID money that the federal government was irresponsibly handing out to large cannabis businesses throughout the pandemic. Well, I say irresponsibly because there's historic overproduction happening right now in Canada's cannabis industry. We're producing about 5 to 10 times more of every finished product and every, you could say, dried bud that we need. So there's a major overproduction, and amidst this overproduction, Canada's federal government was shoveling hundreds of millions of dollars of free money into the companies that were producing the most cannabis, mass producing the most cannabis that we didn't need. So your Canopy Growth and your Aurora Cannabises that were producing cannabis in airport-sized warehouses, they were producing billions of grams of cannabis and selling only hundreds, maybe tens of millions of grams of cannabis. The federal government was pouring money into these businesses to keep people employed, but then the companies were mass laying off people during the pandemic, pocketing the cash and ramping up and still mass producing.
What are the sorts of problems that we're talking about aside from oversupply? I mean, are there tax problems? Are there access problems?
The tax issue needs to be addressed. When companies obtain creditor protection, we can see who they owe money to, which is a great thing for a journalist. But guess who's always at the top of the list? The federal government, and that's not normal. If you look at CCAA filings for other businesses and other industries, the government is nowhere to be seen. Why would the government be an unpaid creditor for a failed business? If that's the case, then that's a structural problem with the industry that the federal government created. The federal government made this tax structure, and now businesses are failing specifically because they're being overtaxed and overfeed. If you look at all the cannabis companies entering CCAA, a substantial portion of their debts are to the federal government. And so unless they change that, more businesses will fail faster. People will lose their jobs. Regular people are losing their investments. This is something that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed very soon.
What's the Indigenous angle on this?
If you do a Control F in the Cannabis Act and a Control F in the regulations, you won't find Indigenous or First Nations mentioned there at all. Actually, they're mentioned once in terms of after 4 years, we're going to review, or 3 years, 3 or 4 years, we're going to review the law. And in particular, we're going to study the law's effect on Indigenous communities. That's the only mention of them in the law, which is outrageously unfair and I think illegal. I think if the Cannabis Act was brought to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court would say that it's unconstitutional because the federal government didn't meaningfully consult with First Nations. They consulted with them, but it wasn't meaningful because they took all this stuff that they were told and they totally ignored it. I've seen this in other industries as well, especially in oil and gas. I think that this is a threat to the industry, and the government has to address it. No one in Canada suffered more under cannabis prohibition than Indigenous people. Indigenous people suffered the most under prohibition, and then they got nothing out of legalization. Nothing. To give people who were criminalized the most under prohibition some kind of entry point into the legal industry. Canada did nothing. The federal government did nothing. So from an ethical standpoint, it's been a major failure because Indigenous people can't enter the industry.